So our first speaker is Dan Bode. He's from Puppet Labs, and he's going to talk a little bit about the state of the union of Puppet, talk about what we're doing and what's going on.
Thanks, Dawn. So hi, everyone. My name is Dan Bode, and I'm with Puppet Labs. And today, I'm going to be giving a pretty different kind of presentation for me. This is actually the first presentation I've ever given that doesn't have any code in the slides. So bear with me. There are no code examples in this presentation. I'm mainly going to be talking about Puppet Labs, about the flagship open source project that we maintain, Puppet, and just kind of a lot about what's been happening in the last year and a lot of the great things that we expect to happen in 2013. So I'm going to try the clicker, make sure everything looks good. So I'm Dan Bode, and if people have follow-up questions, I'm just easily Dan at Puppet Labs. Also Bode PD on Twitter. I'm always on Freenode and Pound Puppet and IRC. Always happy to answer questions. So I wanted to start just with a few quick surveys, and if people could do show of hands. Who is using Puppet, is currently using Puppet here? It's actually almost everyone's using Puppet. And a few new users, or a few people thinking about Puppet. Just a few people. Oh, good. Well, it looks like even if you want to talk to your peers, it looks like there's a lot of people that you can ask who are here have been using Puppet. I was curious, how long have people been using Puppet? Who's been using Puppet? Who just started on 3.0? A few people. Who started on 2.7? On 2.6? Wow, not that many people on 2.6. 2.5? 2.4? Oh, just three of us going back to 2.4. Who's using Puppet DB? It's like about maybe a fifth of the people. Who's using stored configs but isn't using Puppet DB? Just a few people. I would highly recommend that if you are using stored configs, if you are passing data between the masters, or sorry, if you're exporting resources through the masters, then Puppet DB is a huge performance gain. Who's using Puppet Enterprise? That's probably about 10 people. Great. So just getting into it, I was going to start with just some numbers, and I spent some time this week thinking about what numbers really demonstrate what's going on at Puppet Labs that we as a company were happy to share. And I talked to, and the first one is employees, just to show the amount of phenomenal growth that we're having at Puppet Labs. If you look at January of 2012, we were at 55 employees, and now we've doubled to 110, and it's been an interesting time of growth to watch, I guess, internally, a company grow that fast. Most of the growth that we've seen has been engineering, of course, marketing and sales, and also we've had a lot of emphasis on design, so hiring a lot of UX and front-end developers as well. And in terms of expansion, I like the country count. We were selling. We had customers in 29 countries at the beginning of 2012, and now we've sold into 42 countries. So it is interesting to watch, Puppet, be sold infectiously across the world. The other interesting thing, just in terms of the kind of growth that we're expecting, is we recently moved offices in Portland, Oregon, which is our headquarters, and we moved from an office that was 9,000 square feet that started to get a little bit crowded there at the end, into now we have a massive office of 25,000 square feet, which gives us definitely some room to grow in the up and coming years. And the other statistic, just from a perspective of Puppet Labs as a company, I think is looking at Twitter followers of Puppet Labs. And I think it's interesting looking at the company in terms of growth, because it shows kind of our emphasis on marketing and our emphasis on engaging with the world and also starting to measure that engagement. That you can see that our growth in Twitter followers has been phenomenal in the last year. And I think a lot of that is us moving from, kind of a bunch of open source hippies that happen to maintain and curate a project to, really making the evolution to a company. And I think this number speaks to that fairly well. So the meat of what I'm really going to talk about today is Puppet, and really, what kinds of things are we excited about from the last year in terms of feature development and in terms of the development efforts around Puppet, but also looking ahead to what kinds of things do we see coming in 2013. So I wanted to start with just some numbers. The first of which is just to show that we've had, over 1,000 people register on the Puppet users mailing list in the last year. And I think it's a great number just to show that, we have a lot of new people trying out Puppet, and a lot of new people that want to learn more about Puppet and want to lean on the community to get some of those answers. And I'm actually curious, who's posted something on Puppet users? Well, just a few people. Who's responded to posts on Puppet users? Oh, it looks like it's the same people are asking the questions and also responding to the questions. And for people that don't know, but who often searches Puppet users to find the information that they need? I think that's everyone. So I guess a few people are actually contributing to the conversation, but it looks like everyone can take advantage of the fact that if you run into a problem, it's probably already been run into, talked about on IRC, and hopefully resolved on the Puppet users mailing list. And it's worth mentioning, I don't know if I have a slide for it, but I know that I know Don's done a lot of work in the last few months with launching ask.puppetlabs.com, which is a more consolidated view where we're trying to create kind of a better place for people to get together and ask questions and respond to each other. So the other thing, too, which I think is a really great statistic, is just showing the IRC population. So this is, I think, a daily snapshot of users logged into Pound Puppet. Who here is constantly logged into Pound Puppet? It's probably about the same people that are posting to and responding to the mailing list. But you can see it's been about 50% growth, going from about 600 to 900 people. And I really like this stat of looking at Pound Puppet as an indicator of growth, because it does take some amount of effort, right? These are people that are at least engaged enough to stay joined into this IRC channel, right? It requires some effort that there must be, a connection maintained somewhere that's continuing to be maintained. Another one, just looking at the amount of people that are starting to engage with the code base of Puppet, is the next one is just showing growth of the Github Watchers in Puppet Labs, which is maybe an interesting metric in terms of understanding how many people are interested in the code base and interested in following the evolution of the code base. And for people who aren't familiar with the concept of GitHub and watching, it's just a little button that you can push for any project on GitHub, right? To say that you have interest in the code and what's going on. And I think that another metric too is that there's another book this year, this is me slightly shamelessly plugging some of the work that I've been doing in the last few months. But there is kind of an evolving ecosystem of books that are coming out, so you can learn and learn from the expertise of others. This is actually a book that just came out a month ago. It's written by myself and also colleague Nan Liu. It's kind of talking about looking at the internals of Puppet and understanding a lot of the extension points, specifically how to write types and providers, which are all the components that actually can be described as resources and interact with the underlying system. But we also have various books about using Puppet, also a Puppet cookbook that came out in 2011. And in terms of community metrics, I find this one to be the most interesting and also maybe the most telling in terms of how we're evolving as a company. And that's open pull requests. I know that open pull requests and maintaining pull requests hasn't always been something we've been the greatest at But it's really interesting to look at, as we've dedicated people to focus on community patches, how we've been able to kind of in spikes, reduce the total number of pull requests. And right now, for those of you who know Jeff McCune, this is actually Jeff McCune's job, is he's engaging with the community. He's monitoring pull requests, and sorry for people who don't know, this pull request is very GitHub-centric, and that it is a request that here's some code that I would like to contribute into your project, right? And there's interfaces for merging that code. And Jeff McCune's actually assigned to not only review patches on standard lib and factor and Puppet, and I think I'm missing one thing that he reviews patches on, but also to help train and teach the community how to be better contributors, right? Because the quality of the contribution from community makes it that much easier to merge, right? That it should have tests and have a good commit message. So this is one of the areas we've really evolved a lot, is from a company perspective, dedicating resources to say, you know what, if someone's willing to take the time to give us code to fix a bug or to make something better, then we should definitely dedicate the resources to ensure that that code's not just going to sit there and rot. That code can actually make it into the product. And I think this is one of the great things about Puppet, one of the great things about open source in general, is the ability to be able to interact and improve the code base as a community. So I'm going to jump from some of the statistics that I have around Puppet to cover some of the features that we're really excited about that were added in 2012. And for the most part, and I'll be clear about the exceptions, these were features going into 3.0. 3.0 was the big release for 2012, and I think we're starting with the biggest feature of 3.0 is that we've slowly been evolving patterns towards data separation. And I'm just curious, who has a pretty clear understanding of what I mean when I say data separation in terms of what's the problem space, what are some of the solutions that are out there? So the problem is that you have both Puppet logic, which is expressing the things you want to manage, but you also need to be able to conditionally drive the data that configures that logic. And I think the most, one example of this is you may have resources that are completely the same, right? I'm always going to install a package, start some kind of service, configure some files, but the names of those things are often different between distributions. And I think most commonly people are looking at Red Hat-ish based systems, OS family Red Hat, and Debian. So one example of data separation is kind of what are patterns and strategies and solutions that we can have for being able to maintain the same set of resources but drive the data differences between operating systems as some external source. And it starts to look, in that case, a lot like an internationalization problem. Another common problem that people are trying to solve that is beneficial to keep the data separated is that you may have different sites. You may have different countries. You may have different data centers. And you want to configure everything consistently. But if you're in a certain data center, you may need to talk to different IP addresses or different host names in order to communicate to services. And the solutions for this have been evolving with parameterized classes, with Hira. And this is kind of the combination of those two things in 3.0 is that by default, every class parameter, so of course you specify your configuration interfaces using class parameters, all those class parameters will automatically look up their values or the default values in some backend data store. And the default of that is Hira. So every class parameter you have will by default look up into a Hira backend. So you can maintain Hira backends that use facts in order to map values to the defaults for class parameters. And this really has two main feature benefits. Number one is that the way in which we separate the Puppet resources or code from the data is very clear, very consistent. And number two, I forgot what I was going to say. There's probably a second one. So the other thing too is that Puppet module tool is becoming more of an embedded part of Puppet, right? It means that the way that Puppet interacts with the Forge and interacts with content in general is becoming a first-class citizen. And the module tool has kind of lived as a separate component on its own that James Turnbull wrote years ago, but now it's actually part of core. And I think this is really useful because it makes it a lot easier for people to get started with the Forge, but I think it also speaks volumes about where we're headed as a company, that sharing content and making it easier to retrieve shared content is a huge, important part of where we see Puppet and the community and the ecosystem evolving. Just curious, who has modules posted to the Forge? Just a few people, 2 or 3 people. Who's consuming at least one module from the Forge? Well, about half the people, maybe more than half the people. And this is a trend that we hope to see evolve. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the Forge and the fact we have dedicated resources for it, fun stuff like that, a little bit later. So the next thing worth pointing out is that Ruby 193 should work. You know, we've definitely had some sprints ensuring that we can support 193 with Puppet. And as far as I know, there was only one issue with some kind of obscure syntax that I believe has been resolved. And I was just curious, who's using Puppet with 193? Maybe 5 people. And people's experiences are good so far? No? We can talk about that afterwards. You know, if people have issues with 193, please let us know. As far as we know, with the exceptions of a couple syntax things that I think are going to be fixed in 3.1, 193 should be fully supported. But I'm very happy to talk to you about that afterwards. This is somewhat related to the stuff about Hira, but we've changed variable scoping. And I can remember back before I worked at Puppet Labs, back in the 0.24 days, that I never quite grokked how dynamic scoping worked. And I remember that I would occasionally make changes to the manifest and everything would change. But I couldn't quite figure out the way that, you know, nested classes and dynamic scoping was changing things based on the order in which classes were included. So I just remember it'd be like, well, I do this, and that now I don't understand why things are changing. I just won't do that, right? And I think for little dynamic scoping and the way dynamic scoping was like that for a lot of people, that, you know, if things are written in a certain way, you could ensure that you knew what the values of variables were going to be. But sometimes, I don't know. I don't know why the value is set to that. So I think for the longest time, people were saying, well, I just won't do that. And I know that when we created the training program, this is definitely a topic we spent a lot of time talking about, is how variable lookup, you know, progresses through various nested scopes in order to retrieve the current value. Well, in 2.7, we had some deprecation warnings letting people know we're not going to be supporting this behavior anymore. And it's because we're moving to this Hira-based lookup model through class parameters and away from dynamic scoping, because we really want to avoid things where the order in which you include a class might actually affect the final results of how your systems are going to be configured. So no more dynamic scoping going forward, no more annoying but hopefully helpful and useful deprecation warnings like there were in 2.7. And the scoping rules are now pretty simple. If we have a variable, if we use a variable or refer to a variable, then the value of that variable is either coming from the local scope, where you're trying to use it, it's coming from its parent scope, it's coming from the scope of the node, or it's coming from top scope. And there's no other place that the value of variable can come from, right? It's not going to, you know, say, if this class was included in this class, then we'll look to see if the variable was set there. So all dynamic scoping has been eliminated from the language, but it's also been replaced in 3.0 with the fact that the class parameters are automatically plugged into Hira. So if you need to do some more complicated data configuration, you can do it externally using Hira. When I say Hira, everyone knows what that is. Is pretty much everyone using it? Or using XLOOKUP or something Hira-ish? So one of the things that we've done a lot of work in recently, and actually where a lot of work is going to continue, is improving how extensions work in Puppet. And the big improvements we had in 3.0 are that plugins are now lazy loaded. So one of the things this allows you to do is basically configure the requirements for plugins when you synchronize them. So a lot of things used to require 2 runs of Puppet to say, I need 1 run to configure my local system before I can even run plugin sync, right? Because dependencies for those plugins may not even be on the system, which leads to often arcane Ruby exceptions. Plugin sync is on by default, which I actually learned yesterday. I didn't even realize that was true in 3.0, but plugin sync is now on by default, right? If we're communicating to a master, it makes sense that we would always want to retrieve the plugins from that master, because otherwise we don't even really have the information that we need in order to run Puppet. Another thing that I'm kind of excited about is that the extensions can now also be loaded from gems. So if people would rather use gems to deploy certain extensions, that's just going to work by default with Puppet now. And one of the things that didn't quite make 3.0 but will make 3.1 is that faces are going to work properly starting in 3.1. I haven't tested the code yet, but in 3.1 it should be that faces will now, Puppet faces will work both in modules and also through plugin sync as plugins just like everything else. And I think that this was probably one of the big inhibiting factors for using a lot of things we've written as faces and just for faces in general, is that it didn't quite work consistently or how you would expect with the plugin system in Puppet. So one of the interesting emphases of last year was just performance in general. And this is one of those things that I think is because of growth and even because we're now becoming more of a commercial company, we're selling things, we're making money, means we can get more engineers to finally work on things like performance, which has been, not one of our greatest strengths, especially a lot of the anecdotes that we heard about performance issues between 2.6 and 2.7. And I think for people who maybe have experienced some of those issues, people who've had issues with Puppet in the past, it's worth noting that performance is probably one of the main benefits that you get with Puppet 3.0. For a lot of the cases, it's at least at par with how performance was in 2.6. In a lot of cases, it exceeds what the performance was in 2.6. And one of the specific things we've worked on is, there were issues with running Puppet Agent, and there's this whole idea of we'll just run it from cron, because the Puppet Agent didn't always do the greatest job of cleaning up after itself in terms of memory allocation, right? So especially in the old days, when you go back to Puppet 2.4, Puppet 2.5, memory allocation over time would often go like this. So a lot of people moved away from the agent into actually running Puppet out of cron, right? So you're always spawning a new process, so you don't have to worry about memory allocation issues. We've refactored the way the agent works so that it actually spawns a subprocess for the agent run, which just is automatically killed. So, and then it just respawns and kills and respawns and kills, so there's no risk of any memory allocation explosions, I'll call them. And the main problem there is that Ruby, like other languages, it doesn't really allocate memory, right? So once you've allocated memory to a Ruby process, you have allocated it, right? The only way to really clean that up is to kill the process and then relaunch it. So it's important there to make sure that we're not allocating unnecessary memory, or in this case, that we're cleaning up the processes after ourselves. So PuppetDB is definitely worth talking about, and it's categorized, I would say, as a part of Puppet open source, even though it's a backend that we'll be leveraging a lot for Puppet Enterprise in the future, and especially next year. So at a simplistic level, you can say that PuppetDB is a performant backend replacement for stored configs. And it stores, currently, it's storing facts and also storing catalogs, right? So it's storing what are the latest set of facts for a machine and what are the latest set of resources that were compiled into a certain machine's catalog. And one of the exciting things about PuppetDB is it was written by a fantastic group of engineers with a very well-defined API. So it comes with a very well-defined API for how do we actually extract facts from the database, and how do we extract resource information from the database. So it makes it really easy to start to ask questions about your infrastructure in terms of how are things configured in a consistent way and in a way that you know is supported. So it's one of the first steps towards having better tooling for taking advantage of a lot of the data structures in Puppet and a lot of the information that Puppet knows about your infrastructure. And I would say it's definitely worth having a look at. You know, it replaces not only stored configs, but also the inventory service as well, and fact searching. One more thing that's worth mentioning, especially for people who have been in the ecosystem for several years, is that we are committed to semantic versioning, right? And any breakages that don't conform to semantic versioning are going to be bugs, or going to be considered as accidents, mistakes, bugs. And the reason why this is important is semantic versioning, you know, is based on a three-part version number where each of those parts has very specific meanings. You know, a major version change, you know, going from 3 to 4.0 implies breakages and backwards compatibility. Everything else does not. You know, if you look at a minor version change, something like, you know, 2.7.19 to 2.7.20 bug fixes, and a middle version change, something like 3.0 to 3.1 is backwards compatibility breaking changes. So as users, this means that you guys can say, okay, here's a new version. What does that mean? Can I safely deploy this thing? And know that it's been tested and that the features and fixes have been thought about in a way to ensure that they conform to, you know, one of those categories of either not changing anything, only fixing bugs, adding features in a way that doesn't break backwards compatibility versus breaking backwards compatibility. And I know especially in the early days, especially, you know, when things like 2.6 and 2.7 came out, I think the general strategy was wait a little while, you know, to let someone else, you know, sort out the bugs that were inevitably going to come out, or potential, you know, breakages that were inevitably going to come out of the releases. And I think that, you know, as we've matured as a company, that's definitely an area we've matured in, is a lot stricter testing, and we have great integration tests that are running to generate the packages that we have on our website, but also a lot more rigor and procedure about understanding how changes will impact compatibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the changes that we're expecting in 2013, and I should throw up a huge disclaimer for all the slides that are doing this. You know, this is, you know, promises about what's going to happen next year are often difficult, and I think for people who've attended conferences and talks and public camps in the past, we've generally not been entirely accurate at comparing, you know, what we predicted versus reality. But I think that as we evolve as a company and as engineering evolves, it should be easier to make predictions about the things that are coming, and hopefully everything that I tell you will wind up being true. But it is possible that it may not be 100% accurate. So one of the things that we're definitely targeting to fix, and I don't know exactly what the fix is, I know what I wish the fix was going to be, but just fixing general issues around class containment and around containment edges in the graph around classes, which is probably pretty fancy. Who understands what I just said? Few people. Let me try to rephrase that. So if you think about dependencies between containers in Puppet, and by containers, I'm talking about classes and defined resource types, that in general, you can assume that the things that are contained within that container, so it may be, here is a class, this class is called Apache, it has a package of file service, you can assume that if you specify dependencies between those classes, I feel like I need a whiteboard now, then the things contained in those classes will also be a part of that dependency. And in our slightly ridiculous graph theory-centric way of thinking, we call that containment edges, right? That if you think of the dependencies as edges in the graph, then you can also think of some of the edges are the edge that I am contained within another node, so that its dependencies also apply to me. And this consistently applies to everything in Puppet except classes, which is for historic reasons, because we haven't really started to conceptualize classes as resources until 2.6, which is funny for me to rationalize things based off pre-6, given that most people here started in 2.6 or later. But previously, classes were included, so they were a little bit different than everything else. But now, especially because with parameterized classes, since we can declare classes as resources, they start to look a lot like resources. And people would expect them to follow the same rules of resources in general. And this has become, something that's been, I'd say, a hindrance for us internal in terms of writing reusable modules, right? Because if I want to create some encapsulation layer as a class, and you want to create yours, and you want to have a dependency between those two things, it might work. But the reality is that you probably need to go and read all the source code to figure out if that thing has resources or classes or they're mixed. The anchor pattern was created by Jeff McCune, which is that there are special resources in standard lib. That's another good question. Who's using standard lib? Oh, that's surprisingly low. And I would say that it was about 6, 7 people that said that. I would say that if people are using modules from the Forge, it's possible they're using standard lib as a dependency, but not aware of it. So the standard lib has a resource called an anchor, which only really exists to anchor around classes, so that those classes will be contained within whatever classes are specified in, right? So that you can more reliably grab classes and then compose them and specify dependencies between classes. Well, obviously, this is complicated, right? I just spent, 5 minutes explaining it, and probably half the people understood what I just said. So in terms of usability, obviously this is a big problem, that everything should just work like you expect. And this is one of the changes that we're committed to, is making the anchor pattern unnecessary by at least ensuring that there's consistent tooling that you can use to understand how to ensure that classes contained with other classes will actually, that it'll be easier to specify dependencies between classes where those classes contain classes. So that's one of the changes that we're committed to making. A change that I actually learned about just the other day, which I'm still in slight shock of, because I think it's the right thing to do, especially given the amount of people that I've taught Puppet to. We're looking at maybe changing the way that resource ordering works in Puppet in the future. And I know that this will probably be a 4.0 change, because it's potentially backwards compatibility breaking in some ways. So if you go back to before, I don't even think it's 2.7, I think it's like 2.7.9 or something. You have to specify dependencies for everything, but you may have, there's some non-determinism within a graph, that you could just say that 3 things depend on one thing, right? So it means that one thing's going to run, but then what order are those other 3 things going to run in, right? And if you go back to somewhere in the middle of 2.7, the answer was, I don't know. Sometimes you had to run Puppet multiple times to kind of get that random distribution of, what order are those things going to run in, and does it mean I actually have bugs in the way that I'm ordering things? So in 2.7, we changed that. So it was somewhat, you could say non-deterministic, or you could say there were bugs, but the main problem people were having is it worked in testing, now it doesn't work in production. So we made a change where we ensured that the order in which resources ran, given the same catalog or given the same Puppet code, would always be the same. And this was done based off some hashing algorithm that I don't quite understand, but it was not something where the user could predict, and that was actually one of the specifications was that it shouldn't be predictable. It should be that things happen to always run in the same order, but we still want you to specify dependencies explicitly. So one of the questions that I had at the time, and I know that Teo had the same question, was, well, if we want to be completely deterministic in saying that the resources are always going to run in the same order, why not just use parse order, right? To say that, why not just since we're going to pick something anyways, why not just use parse order? And for various reasons, the answer was no. We want people to specify dependencies. We think it's an important feature, but we've really found that it's somewhat of a high barrier to entry, and we've kind of have lessened our opinionated view on that to say, you know what, parse order makes sense, right? Especially for people getting started. If I'm not up to the level of understanding dependencies yet, why not just specify X, Y, Z, A, and then know that that's the order they're going to run in, right? Based on the order they're in the code. This is slated to change right now, right? That there will be a backwards compatibility breaking change in 4.0 so that it will be parse order. And I know that a couple years ago, this was kind of heresy. And it's interesting to see, as we focus more on our users and on what our users are saying, it'll be interesting to see what kinds of things, we've internalized as heresy may actually change in the future. And for me, when I heard this, I was kind of shocked, but also relieved that, oh yeah, I mean, of course, that's, if you look at two of the things I just talked about, when I used to teach the Puppet class, we would spend so much time on dynamic scoping rules and so much time on, understanding resources as a way of getting started. And I think that changing these things is really going to improve the barrier to entry for Puppet. And I think also reduce, for the ordering, I would guess, reduce bugs. Maybe the concern is that maybe people won't be thinking as graph-centric, which will lead to more problems at scale. But dependencies are still going to work like they work now. It's just the default order is going to be based on parse order. Supposedly. I really hope this does come to fruition. So another chunk of work or effort that we're having is just documenting things and actually having APIs. And I think for everyone who's happy to live in the Puppet DSL and focus on manifests, we do have APIs. The DSL itself really is an API, right? We have if statements and conditional logic and classes and defines and resources with strict interfaces. But as soon as you start to consider Puppet to be kind of a framework that you can build solutions on top of, how do you load configuration? How do you, generate types and resources programmatically? And the answer is you can, but it involves reading the source code and then being like, I did it. Is it going to work in the next version? I don't know. Is anyone guaranteeing it'll work in the next version? Probably not, right? So you need to build your hacks, and then it's kind of up to you to say, well, when they break, well, they were hacks, right? How can I know there really is no public documented API? These are the things that are changing, and it's changing for a couple reasons, and one is just because one of the problems that engineering has had since it evolved at Puppet Labs is that, if you have no API, then everything is an API, right? So what does Puppet support? Apparently everything, right? Anything that anyone has set and figured out can be done with Puppet is what we support. And clearly, if we want to run a reasonable engineering department and be able to deliver features in any reasonable kind of way, this doesn't work, right? It can't be that anything that Puppet happens to do is what's supported. It needs to be that we support and test for these things, right? So from our perspective, it makes things a lot easier. But I think also from the end user perspective, to know what those APIs are, people can start to programmatically build on top of Puppet as a platform with confidence. And this is something that I'm extremely excited about because I hack and do weird things with Puppet. It would be nice to have a better idea of, things that are accidentally supported versus really supported. And just for clarification, this is more, Ruby programmatic access as opposed to, manifests and all that stuff has always been a fairly solid API. So we'll give people some time for questions at the end. I'm actually feeling pretty good about time. Anyone have any questions about any of the Puppet related stuff before I move on to Forge? All right, I covered it all, or I've confused everyone terribly. Oh, yes. Yes. The question was,
the question was, can we get the slides? Yeah, we're taping this, so we'll have video of everything, and I'll get the slides posted on the Puppet Labs website in the next few days.
So the next thing that I want to talk about is the Forge, and the Forge is a significant part of our strategy and goal with Puppet in general is, the more people that know Puppet, the more people can connect and share administration experience through Puppet, right? And for that to be successful, there needs to be a central place where people can post things and be able to find the content they want. And I think to some extent that's GitHub now. But I think that moving forward, the Forge is going to be something that sits on top of and interacts with GitHub in order to provide a more specific view of Puppet-related content that's backed by GitHub. So one of the things that I wanted to share about the Forge is just that it has seen phenomenal growth. And I think that some of the numbers are because we've had more of an emphasis internally on working on modules. I know I've worked on a lot of modules in the last year. But also that we have a team that's actually working on improving the Forge. And for people who are familiar with the Forge and who have been familiar with the Forge for the 3 years it's existed, we kind of created it, and then it sat there and accrued content for a while without any real feature adds. And that's changed about in the last 6 months that now I'll get to that in a second. So just some of the stats is that we've seen a 3 times increase in the number of modules. And this and also over a 2 times increase in the number of users. And this really shows that there is need, right? There are people who say, my stuff is cool, right? We should share my stuff. People are publishing that stuff. And also daily downloads. We've seen, in the last year, 4 times the amount of downloads. Right now it's about 2,200 downloads a day. So I want to talk a little bit about Forge in 2012 and some of the changes that we've made. The biggest change that we've made is we actually have a team that works on the Forge, which I should have shown by the numbers because previous to last year, the number of people that worked on the Forge was 0. It had been created and it had kind of persisted. 0 is probably wrong. If it broke, someone would jump on there and fix it. The ops people kept it running. But it was basically the same piece of code that was written by an engineer 3 years ago. Now in the Forge, there's actually a team of people, a designer, a product manager, and some engineers that are focused on understanding how people want to interact with content. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Some of the visible changes on the Forge lately have been download counts, just to start to get a feel for what is popular, what things are popular, which is leading to the bigger question and the bigger problem or the bigger intent of the Forge team is just to make it easier for you out there to say, I am looking for this thing, how do I find it? Right? Because right now it's somewhat painful in terms of, I want this thing, I will search the Forge, I'm going to have to wind up back at GitHub, I'm going to be reading some code, and maybe it's something I can use, maybe it's an example of how I might do something. And this is really the main focus of the Forge team is to understand, how can the Forge be a utility that makes that search process 0, right? Really what we want out of the Forge is, I am looking for this thing, oh, here it is, here's the documentation, now I'm using it, right? Or here's some approval, here's some understanding of if it's tested, the last time it changed, and figuring out what are those stats and how do we make that presentable in a way that people can more easily find the things that they're actually looking for. So some of the things that we added last year, I already said download counts, and also moving documentation front and center on modules, right? And trying to eliminate the process of, going somewhere just to find the link of the code on GitHub so you can read the code, right? So making documentation first class, also showing and linking directly to issues. And there'll be a lot more changes like that in the future. And I see the Forge, evolving more to something that interacts with GitHub, right? Something that just makes it easier to search for particular kinds of content on GitHub. Who uses GitHub? Fairly sparse, actually. It's probably about a 4th or 5th of the people. So looking at towards 2013, one of the more dire requirements of the Forge is just to have better publishing APIs. Right now, to publish and update things, as a contributor to the Forge, it actually takes some clicking. right? So, and the reality is it should just be something you can, program into your release rake task, right? And eventually we should just be able to supply that in Spec Helper. Who knows what Spec Helper is? It's more developer-centric library. Yeah, so Spec Helper is a library that offers a compatibility layer for unit testing, and it also has some module-related rake tasks, especially around development processes around module. It's just Puppet Lab Spec Helper. So the publishing API is something that's important just to make it easier for people who are somewhat sophisticated to get their content in a way that's easy, but also to ensure that it's the latest version of things, right? Because what's the point of having something on the Forge if the reality is people aren't updating the content because it's too many clicks and you need to go to GitHub to actually get the real content, right? So clearly publishing tools are important for ensuring that the quality and latest versions of the content are easier to find. As I alluded towards a little bit, better search tools is really the main motivation in terms of how do people interact with modules, how do people find what they want. And one of the ways that we're doing this, which has been interesting, is with actual user testing. And if people are interested in user testing, I think Puppet Labs is always looking for people who are interested in helping us with user tests. And we had done some user tests starting at PuppetConf for the Forge, specifically around how can someone go through the process of installing Apache with a module, right? To watch, what did they do? They went to the Forge, they went back to Google, they went to GitHub, they read the code, and those are the things we're trying to eliminate, because you should go to the Forge, read some documentation, and use it. And the last thing is more than manifests, and this ties a lot into what I talked about in terms of the evolution of the plugin system, that in the Forge we'll see more faces, we'll see more command line extensions in Puppet, we'll see more native types, we'll see much more Ruby extensions living in the Forge. But the first step for this and what we're finishing now is just ensuring that the plugin system and the way that Puppet can load these extensions works correctly, right? And now that we're kind of on the edge of that, I think we'll see a lot more different kinds of things besides manifests, right? Because as soon as we can just download things from the Forge into our module path and they work, right? That's the ideal user state, right? You should be able to download all kinds of different extensions. And I think we'll see a lot of that next year on the Forge, at least for people who are using 3.0 and 3.1 and higher. Any questions about Forge before I move on? Yes?
Is there something explicit about how licensing works for people who post modules or want to post modules or things like that?
No, it's totally up to you. No, it's totally up to you. We have a general preference on Apache, but there's no requirement about what license a module could have. I'd prefer looking at Apache or MIT just because I think that it lowers, if you want people to use it, I think those are the licenses where any company is going to be like, that's fine to use it. People who want to use GPL, there's definitely no problem. Sorry, does this answer your question? Is that the?
More concerned about do you require licensing at all so that it's
I don't think we require licensing. I don't know anything about that. But I would recommend that people license things. But I don't think it's any kind of a hard requirement to have licenses for modules on the Forge. But it is, I would definitely strongly recommend it because a lot of people, and I know because I generate a lot of Puppet content, and the few times when I've forgotten to include a license, I've gotten an email being like, I would love to use this, but absolutely no way without a license. And more specifically, probably no way if it's not Apache or MIT licensed.
Just to add on to that, it would be nice if it's part of the publishing API, the licensing itself.
Yeah, I think that's
require a field or something like that. But could you comment about support on hosting a private Forge within corporate firewall?
This is something that I should have mentioned. This is, given how often this question comes up, it will hopefully be something prioritized this year. And I know that Ryan Coleman, who's running the Forge team, is actively engaging with customers to help build out needs and user requirements for private Forge. I hope, How about this? I would have liked to have put it on here, but it's one of those things where it could slip. But there's no question that it's important, and especially given, we look at hands raised on who's using GitHub, clearly there's a lot of need for some kind of private forge. So I would expect that hopefully we'll be talking more about that in the future. But clearly we're only in the requirements gathering phase at the moment. Any other questions? Great. So I want to talk about one of the new things as of probably Q3, Q4 of last year, which is the Puppet certification process. I'm just curious, who is Puppet certified? Just 2 or 3 people? I should raise my hand too. I took the test. Who has interest, just general interest in certification? Okay, probably 10 or 15 hands raised there. So certification process, just to talk a little bit about numbers. We launched the Puppet Professional certification at PuppetConf. It's currently a test. And so far, we have 110 people that are certified as Puppet Professionals. I just included, I'm number 28. I was a little lazy and didn't get up early in the morning, so. 17? Oh, good work. Yeah, you obviously woke up earlier than me. Yeah, so 110 people are certified, and definitely, yeah, we're extremely interested in getting more people Puppet certified, and I think that job trends and general interest in growth and buzzwords like DevOps are showing a demand, and I think it is useful. I think it's a great test, and I would expect to see, those things to continue with PuppetConf. I'm missing one slide, but we're actually have some partners in some testing center. Clearly, I'm not affiliated with this department, but it should be really easy to find localized places, and there's basically testing constantly, right? And there's localized testing centers. I don't know what these things are called, that are kind of spread out everywhere that we use. So the other thing that has happened in terms of certification is we launched the beta for the Puppet developers, and for that one we're still engaging in trying to get more beta testers so that we can better understand which questions are good, which questions are bad. For that one, just because the breadth of the things that we could cover related to extending Puppet is so massive that we're definitely looking for testers to better understand that space. Was anyone brave enough to be one of the beta testers here? It is. Yeah? Oh, I thought I saw a hand up. It's a slightly grueling test, but it is interesting in terms of, that it at least shows us that we need to document a lot of this stuff better.
So at the rate at which things are changing in the Puppet development, how set in stone these certifications going to be? Because I would suspect that if you certified a year ago, things have changed drastically in the last 12 months.
So the question was, given the rate of change with Puppet-related things, how is a certification going to stand up with time? I would say that in general, I think it's fairly relevant. It's hard for me to predict what the rate of change is going to be in the future, but the reality is it'll always be based on resources. The resource model is fairly similar. I don't see the data structures changing very much. There's a Puppet Enterprise component to the certification, and I see that stuff evolving pretty quickly. But I think most of the certification, and probably I'll just make up a number, maybe 90% is based on open source Puppet, and I don't see that kind of stuff evolving very often, very, very quickly, because it's mainly focused on language usage, DSL, certificate deployment, client server, and I don't see that stuff changing dramatically, at least not in the next year. For the Puppet developer test, I also don't see that changing, when it's released as a real certification, which I might be number 1 for that when it's released. So I think I was one of the first people to do the beta of it. I also don't know how much, that may be the one that's going to change pretty rapidly. But for people who understand a lot of the APIs for creating functions and facts and types and providers, that stuff basically hasn't changed in 4 or 5 years. But maybe it is subject to change. Any other questions? So just a little preview of the kinds of things that we're thinking about for 2013. One is the Puppet developer stuff will definitely go live. We just need to get some more beta testers so we can have that. It's a fairly grueling test, not for the faint of heart. But I think that especially as the documentation improves, it'll be a lot better to have a really good grasp of extending Puppet with Ruby. And of course, just my little call to action is that, of course, we're extremely interested in having more Puppet professionals, and that's one of the things we expect in 2013 is just rapid increase in the number of people getting certified. So talking a little bit about training, and I have just a few sections left, good, because I'm running out of time. So training by the numbers, this is somewhat of a guesstimate. We've probably trained about 3,000 people in Puppet. I can say that myself, I feel like I've trained 1,000, but maybe not that high. I think it's probably well above this, and it's funny, I was looking at the numbers, and not that many people have been around for as long as I have, and I even could tell that obviously there's some data gaps in the early history of companies when we were all, when the VP professional services was traveling 90% of the time. We were not maybe doing the best job about record keeping. So I would expect that it's well above this number of people who have been trained either in the Puppet Master or Puppet Developer class. Just curious, out of here, who's been to one of those classes? It's probably about 10 people or so. I think it's a good class, but I'm also biased because I wrote a lot of version 1 of that, which has since been revamped. I had a little bit of fun putting this graph together just because I was curious, what countries have we actually offered trainings in? And looking at the projections, I wanted to have a two-tone graph so that I could show were we expecting to have it next year versus this year. But the problem with that is, that a lot of the partners we work with, have ambitions, but I'm not sure how that ambition is going to map to reality. But I would expect to see this at least double in this year coming up. That there are going to be way more classes offered in way more countries. And a lot of that is just because we're getting a much more sophisticated partner network set up. For, a lot more partners are now trained and certified to offer the training. But you can see a lot of it's been mainly North America and Europe. And Australia. Australia is actually a huge market for us. Yeah, but it's growing. And yeah, I think we're probably always hiring in PS, so people who want to travel to these kind of places, and the ever-expanding list of traveling everywhere. We're always looking for people that love to travel and don't have roots. It can be grueling. I was in PS for a while, and it was fairly grueling, but also awesome. So the current courses that we offer in training, we have the Puppet Fundamentals, which covers a lot of the basics of syntax and usage. Also, the Advanced Puppet, I'm pretty sure is synonymous with Developing Puppet, which covers a little bit of Ruby, a lot of the extension points for Puppet. And coming up this year, we're going to launch a new fundamentals class or version 2 of it. We're going to have extending Puppet using Ruby as a class, right? So a lot of the extension points and documented extension points, types, providers, facts, functions. Also, we're going to start offering a Ruby primer and some online courses. Well, I'm seriously running out of time. So this is the educational track that we're seeing as kind of, do you want to be a developer versus kind of user of Puppet, both going through fundamentals, but the developer track going through, introduction to Ruby, and eventually going through the Puppet developer certification. And then one of the certifications we eventually want is something that kind of combines the two into a real advanced Puppet or the Puppet Master certification. Sorry, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, and actually I'm almost to the last slide. I just want to talk about some of the things that we're looking at for Puppet Enterprise going forward. And it's a pretty quick list. But the main focus of Puppet Enterprise for 2013 is going to be around release management. So just the process of, how do we actually manage change? How do we actually manage release process for applications, for infrastructure? And how do we build tools that can really leverage Puppet as a part of that process? And these will be built based on PuppetDB. PuppetDB is going to add reports, so it'll be a consistent storage and set of APIs for facts, resources, reports, and it'll be about leveraging that information, integrating Puppet with version control to have better workflows for release management. Ooh, I'm in the negative now. The other one is going to be just change visualization in general. How do we take all this information out of PuppetDB, because it stores just a huge amount of information about facts related to inventory information and resources related to what you're managing, where you're managing it, reports related to what's happening, what's changing. So a lot of the focus will be just on how do we visualize this? How do we create better visualization tools? And of course, we're always looking for user information about what kind of development tools are people integrating with, what do development processes look like, and how are people performing change management? How do people want to perform change management in the future?